So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn event entitled Understanding the Linguistic Duality Debate Through a Historical Lens, 2019, 1969, and 1929. My name is Lina Shumarova. I work as a Knowledge Mobilization Coordinator at the Quebec English-Speaking Communities Research Network, or QUESCREN, at Concordia University, and I will be your moderator for today. Before continuing, I would like to make a territorial acknowledgement and acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodian of these lands and waters. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future of our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. So we are very excited to have with us today Robert Talbot, who will present some very interesting aspects of the history of the Canada's Official Languages Act. A final acknowledgement also about our funder. This event was made possible through the financial support of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Robert Talbot has been the Manager of Research at the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages of Canada since 2017. From 2013 to 2018, he taught history at the University of Ottawa and served as English Language Secretary of the Canadian Historical Association. He completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of New Brunswick and a PhD in history at the University of Ottawa, specializing in Francophone-Anglophone relations. Robert, it is great to have you with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lina. Thank you for that kind introduction and for the invitation and the opportunity to be here and to speak with everyone today. So yes, hello, bonjour. So I work for the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages, which is a federal institution. So like any good public servant, I must say that while I do work for the office, I do not speak for the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages. Just a few quick words on who we are. So the Commissioner of Official Languages is an agent of Parliament. So that means that he is independent. He is of the federal level of government, but he is independent of the government of the day. So we are in a position to be able to act and to speak independently of the positions of whoever might be governing at the federal level. Our office's mandate is to promote and protect official languages, and to promote official languages and to protect official language rights, including the rights of official language minority communities, so English speakers in Quebec and French speakers elsewhere in Canada. Our research is part of our promotional role, and that's where I come in. I'm manager of research at our office. We research a variety of topics, including more recent projects that we've done. We did a study on linguistic insecurity in the federal public service. We recently published an article on multiculturalism and official bilingualism for the 50th anniversary of the multiculturalism policy. That was out just the other week. We're also conduct public opinion research and research on the history of official languages and Anglophone-Francophone relations. And today's presentation relates in particular to these last two items. So the presentation today is entitled Understanding the Linguistic Duality Debate Through a Historical Lens in 2019, 1969, and 1929. So I think in terms of the objective of this research, and this was research that it's based on an article that will be published in a publication that's being put out by QUESCREN jointly with the ICRML, the Institut Canadien de Recherche sur les Minorités Linguistiques. The objective of this research, I think, goes to the the point that if we want to understand how to communicate the importance of official languages to the broader public, we need to understand how this has been done in the past. You know, what have been some of the recurring themes in the national conversation and the discourse? What have been some of the recurring arguments for and against federal bilingualism? What has worked? What hasn't? Can we challenge the claims to originality of contemporary opposition to federal bilingualism? So why look at 2019, 1969, and 1929? Well, firstly, it's kind of cool because they're sort of symmetric, you know, we go back 2019, then 50 years to 69, 40 years to 1929. So that's kind of neat. But beyond that, I think these are key moments in the evolution of the country's federal linguistic regime and in the debate. Of course, in 2019, we had the 50th anniversary of the Official Languages Act. In 1969, the adoption of the act itself. And in 1929, 40 years earlier, federal bilingualism was introduced at the post office, or at least some modest measures, which are modest by today's standards, but were important, I think, in the context of the times in 1929. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. Also, these dates or these years occurred around or shortly after big anniversaries of Confederation. The 60th anniversary in 1927, where there was a big celebration, the 100th, of course, in 1967, and the 150th of Confederation in 2017. So these years come on the heels of big debates and discussions about the very nature of Canada itself. And I think linguistic duality, of course, lies at the heart of what Canada is. The dates also, I think, are far enough apart that when we're looking at them, it's all new players at the table. You know, these are new generations of people that we're looking at for each date. It's not just simply the same people repeating arguments or assertions that they've made before. One thing I need to note about the presentation too, so a big caveat is that in this presentation, I'll be looking very specifically at attitudes in English-speaking Canada. Not exclusively, but largely. So I'll be looking largely at attitudes in English-speaking Canada as a whole. And for 1929, I'll be looking in particular at Western Canada and at my own native province of Saskatchewan, where I'm originally from. And I'll get to why. You'll see why in a moment. So I have to say, I don't touch specifically on the English-speaking community of Quebec, but I do have exploratory comments or questions, actually, about the community that I'd like to mention at the end of the presentation, and a question that I'd like to put to participants, because just for my own interest and also an opportunity to learn from the perspectives of the people of you here at the presentation today. So if you can humor me, I'd appreciate it. So the research in terms of methodology, it's based on my own observations about the recent public discourse around the 2019 and the 50th anniversary of the Official Languages Act. It's also based on a review we did of newspapers from 1968, 1969, as well as looking at some important secondary sources, like Jose Igartua's important book, The Other Quiet Revolution, where he talks about the evolution of English-Canadian public opinion. And then also some of my own research that I've conducted at Library and Archives Canada, as well as the archives in New Brunswick, the public archives in New Brunswick. So moving on. In his June 2018 article entitled Beyond Bilingualism, Montreal author Mark Abley stated that, and I quote, "The Official Languages Act incarnates a vision of Canadian identity that to many people seems less and less relevant, owing to Canada's increasingly multilingual nature and the continued erosion of French outside Quebec." In his own defense of cuts to French language services in Ontario a few years ago, Ontario Premier Doug Ford pointed out that the province was home to other linguistic groups, Mandarin, Cantonese, and Italian, for example, explaining that, and I quote, "You can't please everyone." So I think the logic remains the same for these different assertions. Language rights are framed as a zero-sum game. Different minority groups are to be weighed one against the other, not for the purposes of granting more rights and recognition, but rather for the purposes of removing rights and recognition already established. In such a race to the bottom, I think, the only group left with anything is inevitably the majority community itself. 50 years ago, on the eve of the adoption of the Official Languages Act, we heard similar arguments. In June 1969, one Toronto columnist explained his opposition in what might be familiar terms to us today, and I quote, "We are not afraid of any aspect of the new language bill. We simply regard this new Official Languages Act as unnecessary, politically motivated, costly to implement, divisive, and as it affects the non-English, non-French third of the population, wholly discriminatory," end quote. So for this opponent of bilingualism, I think fainting concern for the plight of allophones provided a convenient, if I would assert disingenuous, means to argue against official language minority rights. Other majoritarian and populist arguments against official bilingualism were also invoked in 1969. For example, the tactic of minimizing the demographic weight of official language minority communities was a means to assert that recognition of the local minority constituted an unreasonable imposition on the rights and interests of the local majority. In one letter to the Globe and Mail, for instance, that we came across, a person writing from Manitoba stated that federal bilingualism wasn't necessary because in Manitoba, the Francophone population was less than 1%. But when you actually look at the data at the time, it was more like 7% of the population. Opponents of the Official Languages Act in 1969 also sought to minimize the importance of the French language in particular in the federal public service, and asserted that the language requirements would lead to discrimination against unilingual Anglophones. Conspiracy theories, or what we might call fake news today, were also present in 1969. This is not a new thing. Notably, the assertion that the Official Languages Act was in fact a plot to force all Canadians to become bilingual, whether they wanted or not. So all that being said, we must not forget that there were also those from the English-speaking majority who came out in defense of the Official Languages Act in 1969. According to Jose Igartua and our own analysis of the newspapers of the day, the English language press coverage in 1969 was actually mostly positive. Furthermore, the press helped to play an important role in helping to moderate the Anglo-Canadian discourse. Certain English language papers in 1969 talked about the importance of national unity as a reason why we needed an Official Languages Act. As the Kitchener-Waterloo Record put it, and I quote, "Without linguistic duality, Canada would cease to exist," end quote. Other Anglophone supporters of the Official Languages Act in 1969 saw in it an invitation to become bilingual for those who wanted it for themselves or for their children. One letter to the editor in the Globe and Mail highlighted the growth in demand for French language courses. They noted the international appeal of the French language and the innate human desire of individuals to learn about another culture and another reality, both in Canada and abroad. Other sympathetic Anglophone authors invoked the fact that the Official Languages Act constituted a simple act of justice for official language minority communities, and they mocked a little bit the opponents of official bilingualism. The Vancouver Sun put it in these terms, and I quote, "In years to come, Canadians will wonder why there should have been so much contrived meanness shown in 1969 about such an obviously fair piece of legislation as the Official Languages Bill. Despite the fears of the honest doubters and the barely disguised racialism of the bigots, the public has endorsed the principle that French speakers outside Quebec must have the same rights as English speakers inside Quebec." So yes, looking back another 40 years into the past, so before the Official Languages Act, we can see that Canadians were invoking similar arguments, both for and against federal bilingualism, the plus ça change, right? This was notably the case in my own province of birth, Saskatchewan, at a time when the federal government was taking its first very modest steps toward a quasi-official bilingualism. So first, a little bit of context. In the late 1920s, Canada adopted bilingual stamps, and in 1929, it made all postal forms bilingual and started hiring a small number of bilingual staff for certain post offices in Manitoba, in Ontario, and New Brunswick, in addition to Quebec, where this was already a practice. And so we might think, you know, oh, the post office, big deal, right? Stamps, we don't write as many letters by hand as we did in the past. But this actually was a pretty big deal at the time. We have to remember that Canadians' main point of interaction with the federal government was arguably at the post office. And for most Canadians at the time, this was their principal means of communication, of sending goods, of talking to people. So seeing stamps in both languages in the late 1920s was a big deal because it was a real clear affirmation of the two languages as quasi-official languages for the country. It's interesting to note too that this initiative was backed by no other than an Acadian, Pierre Vigneault, who was a federal minister, one of the first francophones from outside Quebec to be appointed as a federal minister. He was the Postmaster General. And so as an Acadian, and actually a former premier of New Brunswick who had just lost an election, Vigneault saw an opportunity to assert the place of the two languages outside Quebec and in Canada as a whole. So Vigneault enthusiastically backed these measures to make the post office more visibly bilingual. However, in my own home province of Saskatchewan, of course, I wasn't alive at the time, so I'm not accountable for it, but this became somewhat explosive out west. The measures led to a highly charged debate in Saskatchewan. And this happened when a story was published about a provincial judge who received a bilingual postal card and refused to accept it because both languages were appearing on it. So this kind of became a bit of a thing in the press, shall we say. So in September of 1929, just on the eve of the Great Depression, the Regina Daily Star, which was the province's leading conservative organ at the time, reacted. And it had this to say, and I quote, "The Postmaster General of Canada has had bilingual material printed for use in Western Canada as part of the plot to force English-speaking people to acknowledge French as the language of Canada. It is a crafty trick. Demand is even being made that our money should be bilingual." God forbid, right? Okay, I continue. Efforts to bring the civil service of Canada under French control have been made effective by departmental regulation. The regulation takes the form of a preference in all appointments and promotions of those who are bilingual. There will be no let up in the efforts of the Quebec influences. The campaign to force French upon the British majority in Western Canada is untiring and unceasing, end quote. So that was one newspaper. Other opponents of federal bilingualism in 1929 used arguments that were, shall we say, less prejudicial, and more developed, including arguments similar to those that we might hear 40 years later in 1969, or even 19 years later in 2019 and beyond. One Saskatchewan lawyer, A.M. Murray, for example, in a series of letters that he exchanged with Pierre Vigneault, the Postmaster General, summed up several of these, I think, typical arguments of the time. Murray asserted that French was on the decline internationally and that English was the more modern language. He minimized the demographic importance of French in Western Canada and lumped the language together with other foreign languages. And here I'll read a little bit from one of the letters from Murray to Vigneault. "Now, sir, most people have nothing whatever against French as such, any more than they may have against any other foreign language. To me, personally, French is a beautiful language. Nevertheless, I respectfully beg to emphasize that English is the medium of human interaction in this province. You see, we have a very cosmopolitan population. There are Scandinavian, German, Slovakian, and other foreign settlers with their descendants in Saskatchewan, who greatly outnumber French Canadians and their descendants, people who contend with perfect justification that their languages are just as much entitled to a place on government material. The consequence is that they resent the government's use of French," end quote. So all that having been said, so Murray says, we've got other languages, why French? What about all these other languages? But of course he goes on to clarify that he has no intention to support greater recognition of this broader diversity. Rather, we should just get rid of recognizing French to avoid not recognizing other languages. So this kind of race to the bottom argumentation. And I quote again, "Government material should, of course, be printed entirely in English, as it is obviously impossible to print every language spoken in Saskatchewan," end quote. So for opponents of federal bilingualism, like Murray in 1929, as would be the case in 1969 or 2019 and beyond, invoking Canada's broader diversity was sometimes used as an argument of convenience, intended to deny the importance of official language minority rights, and having no intention whatsoever to promote the interests of other language groups or ethnocultural minorities. So all that having been said, we must acknowledge too that in 1929, as in 1969 and today, the anti-bilingualism advocates are not the only ones speaking up. There were others seeking to influence the English language discourse around official languages. And I'd like to talk about them because I think the moderates in our history, moderates in the discourse, don't always get, I think, the recognition that they deserve. And so I'd like to speak to them a bit. One of those was Charles Dunning, a former premier of Saskatchewan, who allied with Pierre Vigneault, they're both pictured here, to organize a promotional campaign among journalists and federal politicians in Western Canada. So among the Anglophones involved in this promotional campaign defending official language rights in 1929, there was a sense of frustration, even a sense of culpability or embarrassment in some of the negative attitudes that had been expressed and that were coming out of Western Canada in particular. One of these wrote to Vigneault apologizing for his province. He suggested that Saskatchewan was the victim of an intolerant discourse that was being imported from the US, from the notorious Ku Klux Klan, no less, which did expand into Saskatchewan at the time. This was a rhetoric that sought to normalize racist attitudes by using what we might call today, again, fake news or conspiracy theories, or exaggerating the reach of official language measures. And to quote this sympathetic Anglophone writing to Vigneault, "It is a characteristic of the anti-bilingual newspaper to mention a part of a fact in such a manner as will leave a false impression in the mind of the reader, and to harp on the strings of racial and religious discord. It would not be hard to establish a direct link, a direct connection, in fact, between the Canadian KKK in Saskatchewan and the American KKK in New York," end quote. So for their part, these moderates from 1929 would invoke arguments in defense of federal bilingualism that I think, again, would be familiar to us today. So just as the arguments against federal bilingualism from the past are not unfamiliar to us today, the arguments in favor also bear some resemblance as well. So the Moose Jaw Daily Times, for example, another newspaper, insisted that bilingualism at the post office had been put in place for reasons of simple justice, efficiency, and to ensure a good communication with all Canadians. To make the point, the newspaper emphasized the importance of the official language minority communities across Canada and asserted that French, just like English, was truly a Canadian language. And I quote, "There are thousands of post offices in Canada, extended from Prince Edward Island to Vancouver. Postal forms in French, or at least bilingual in character, are an absolute necessity in Quebec, but also in certain portions of Ontario and the Maritimes, and even in certain districts in all provinces," end quote. The Regina Leader newspaper reminded its readers that bilingualism was an integral part of Canada's history and that it hurt no one. The paper also poked fun at the opponents of bilingualism and their conspiracy theories. And here I quote, "The other day, a French letterhead reached the office of the conservative newspaper at Regina. This led the editor to a brisk gnashing of teeth and a sturdy editorial declamation to the effect that the influence of Quebec has been brought to bear. What next? The fact is that Ottawa is used to French and that the situation emerged at Confederation under Sir John A. Macdonald. Perhaps the boys in Saskatchewan should open a campaign to get rid of Macdonald as a traitor to the English language," end quote. For his part, Charles Dunning, the former premier of Saskatchewan, highlighted the international and personal advantages of bilingualism. And here he is quoted in the French language press at the time. "La belle leçon de bilinguisme que nous a donné la Société des Nations à Genève devrait inciter tous les Canadiens à mieux connaître les deux langues officielles de ce pays Les Canadiens capables de parler les deux langues ont de grands avantages sur les autres, end quote. Finally, the Anglophone moderates once again invoked the history of linguistic duality and the importance of federal bilingualism for national unity. The Moose Jaw Evening Times put it in these terms. Confederation was a union not only of provinces, but of peoples, the French-speaking and the English-speaking, to make one great dominion. Without either of them, Confederation would have been impossible. What to make of it all? I think if certain arguments of yesterday and of today seem familiar to us, does this mean that we have been witness to a dialogue de sourds, as one researcher put it, that has been going on for nearly a century, where people are debating and not listening to each other? To be honest, I'm not so sure. I think while many of the arguments have stayed the same, the relative emphasis has changed, but also we have to acknowledge that attitudes have changed significantly since 1929 and since 1969. Is it impossible to imagine that the continuing contribution of moderate civil society leaders to the public discourse has had a positive impact? Already by 1936, a strong majority of Anglophone and federal MPs would vote in favor of an even more important measure, the adoption of bilingual currency for Canada, including 16 out of 21 MPs from Saskatchewan. So, you know, we're not all bad. Many of us are fans of linguistic duality. By 1969, surveys at the time suggested that a modest majority of the general population also supported the adoption of an official languages act, putting support somewhere between 55 and 70%. Today, according to a survey that our office conducted in 2016, some 84% of Canadians supported the idea of bilingualism for all of Canada. So to be sure, public opinion is always subject to change. You know, could the normalization of populist majoritarian discourse south of the border these last few years have had an impact here in Canada in 2019 and beyond, just as it did in 1929? Are moderates still able to influence the public discourse to the same extent today as they were in the past? In 1929 and 1969, moderates had an important means via the printed press to help shape the public discourse. But today's popular means of communication allow just about anyone to publish and disseminate their opinions with or without fact checking. And the spoils often go to those who yell the loudest, talk the fastest, forego nuance, and express the most shocking or extreme views. Nuance and reflection, two critical means for encouraging moderate discourse, do not lend themselves to a world restricted to 280 characters at a time. In 2019 and beyond, just as in 1969 and 1929, I think it is critical that English and French-speaking moderates from civil society continue to participate actively and unapologetically in our national conversations, and that we continue to develop an argumentation that's informed by the past, but also relevant to the social, political, cultural, and linguistic context of today. When it comes to engaging on the question of linguistic duality, we must speak to issues that have long resonated with people, including the centrality of linguistic duality to national unity, Canada's history, our self-image, and our place in the world, the continued presence, demographic vitality, and contributions of official language minorities to Canada in general, the need for meaningful access for both linguistic groups to the opportunities and advantages that come with individual bilingualism, including equitable participation in government, and the complementarity and mutually reinforcing potential of linguistic duality and Canada's broader cultural and linguistic diversity. So now I think I'd like to, if we have time, to move on to questions, and I'd love to hear if there are questions from participants. And I have a question for you as well. I'd be curious to know, for those who are interested in speaking up, what do participants think about the role of moderates in creating a dialogue between English and French speakers in Canada more generally, and more specifically, how they think English-speaking Quebecers in particular have helped bridge French-speaking Canada and the Anglophone majority outside Quebec. I have often come across in my own research, historical examples of English-speaking Quebecers being right in there, acting as interlocutors of a linguistic duality, explaining or interpreting Quebec for Anglophones in the rest of Canada. Because us English speakers outside Quebec, we often don't get it, but English-speaking Quebecers have often been there to help, to hold our hands and to provide context and explain things to us. You know, there are really inspiring examples from the history. And I think we need a narrative that includes the role that English-speaking Quebecers have played as bridge builders between English and French in Canada more generally. You know, we can think of Frank Scott, who was a prominent advocate of Canadian independence and an advocate of a French language, of recognition of both official languages, and a member of the Bilingualism Bicultural Commission. We can think of Olga Melikoff, Muriel Parks, and Valerie Neal, known as the founding mothers of French immersion, originally from Saint-Lambert, but who opened up this, helped create this program that now exists across the country. And it's because of this program that I can speak French today. We can think of Victor Goldbloom, who was Commissioner of Official Languages in the 1990s during the Second Quebec referendum. Even artistic ambassadors like Oscar Peterson, who had a song named Place Saint-Henri, Leonard Cohen, who spoke to the dynamic between English and French in Canada. Anyway, I don't want to, I won't take it any further than that, but I wonder what participant or audience members might think of this concept of the importance of moderates in the discourse more generally, and then more specifically, how English-speaking Quebecers have played a role in fostering that discourse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert, for this great presentation. And we can open the floor for questions. We already have a question in the chat from Karina Deer, who is asking about where do Indigenous languages fit in?
Thank you. So in the, are we talking about in the research or in, well, I'll speak maybe specifically to the research and then more generally. I didn't come across it being raised in 1929, which isn't a surprise, nor, well, it was discussed, it did come up in the Bilingualism Bicultural Commission in the 1960s. And then, of course, a very prominent theme in 2019 and today and beyond. So that's a great question. Where do Indigenous languages come in? I think it's, I'm glad, and our organization is glad to have seen the adoption of an Indigenous Languages Act a couple of years ago, in 2019, in fact, and the creation of an office of a Commissioner of Indigenous Languages at the federal level. And I think it's also important to try to understand how these things intersect and overlap. We have Canadians from who might have English or French as a first official language, but who also speak an Indigenous language. I think it's a big question. I'm maybe not the best person to answer, but we're glad to have seen that there has been some action on that file recently.
Thank you. We have received good feedback, great feedback about your presentation. Laura Cope says, thank you, Robert. Your comprehensive presentation was helpful and informative. Malaika Mohammed also thanks you for the informative presentation and says it really helps me gain historical perspective on the issue. Had no idea bilingualism across Canada started with stamps. We have a question, and I see that we have also a raised hand. So I will start with Lorraine O'Donnell's question, and then we'll address the question of David Birnbaum. Lorraine is asking, Robert, why do you think Bill 101 is so much better known than the Official Languages Act?
That's a great question. You could probably speak to that more effectively than me, I think, Lorraine. In Quebec, are we talking about in Quebec or in Canada as a whole? Maybe.
In Quebec, maybe.
In Quebec specifically? Well, you know, yeah, that's I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that, honestly. I wonder, and now this is, shall we say, educated speculation, maybe more so just speculation, but Bill 101 is in the news a lot more. And also a lot of things that are a provincial jurisdiction, you know, that affect us in our day-to-day lives, not necessarily in the same way that things at the federal level, like with the Official Languages Act. But the federal level is important. The Official Languages Act is important. But sometimes those things that are sort of more in our face and day-to-day are more obvious to us. And so that's, I think, would be part of it. And then also Bill 101, you know, it places a lot more emphasis on one language as opposed to two. And so right there you have something of a lightning rod. But it's also become, Bill 101 is also well known outside of Canada, outside of Quebec as well. And I think partly for the same reasons. It is in the news more often. There's often more controversial stories around it. So that makes the news, that gets the clicks. People will are more likely to read about that. But there's also a perception among some that Bill 101 has helped, like the Official Languages Act itself, has helped to make Canada politically possible too. That's something that we hear sometimes in and outside of Quebec. So that's my, perhaps, shall we say, educated speculation on that question. That great question, Lorraine. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. David Birnbaum, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. First of all, it's great to see so many old colleagues and friends. I'm the Liberal Opposition MNA responsible for relations with English-speaking community, and I'm right in the middle of our Bill 196 debate right now. We've just concluded 3 weeks of commission hearings on it. Just a couple of very quick observations, if I might. And I very much appreciate your presentation, Mr. Talbot. We continue to have work to do with respect to sensitizing majority communities to the role, I think, that our minority language communities have played in terms of linguistic duality. Just two disappointing observations that I would add. In these hearings, Canada's principal representative of its Francophone minority communities made the last presentation to these hearings on Bill 96, which, as you all know, is a subject of great concern, large measure of anger and insecurity in our English-speaking communities, in all of their diversity. And in their 10-minute presentation and in their written brief, which was largely favorable to the legislation and made almost no allusion to any of its inherent problems for linguistic minorities, I allowed myself to ask them a question. Time didn't allow them to answer, but they did not want to answer it either. I asked them about my surprise and disappointment at their 100% lack of any mention or allusion to the other minority linguistic community in Canada, that is us English-speaking Quebecers, nor to any of the issues which could have an impact on French-speaking communities outside of Quebec that are raised by Bill 96, not the least of which is the blanket implementation of la clause dérogatoire, the notwithstanding clause. So we still have so much work to do. The other observation I'd make is when we talk about the Official Languages Act and its role in providing some glue for the unity of Canada. Ironically, I've often thought, and a growing number of people absolutely agree, quite ironically, but Bill 101 is an essential part of the glue of Canada as well. I am one of those who would bet on the fact that Canadian unity would be a thing of the past if Bill 101 was not adopted within the United Canada, notwithstanding the fact that many of us might have some remaining difficulties with certain parts of Bill 101. But all of which to say there remains work to be done with respect to mutual understanding between the majority communities and between the minority communities. So that would be my vote for more research and outreach like this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate those comments. And yeah, I think the consensus in the historiography about Bill 101 is that however one may feel about certain provisions, that within the bill, that aside, that it is one of those things that has perhaps made Canada politically possible, like you say.
Robert, we have in the chat a note from Caroline Riches, who is responding actually to the question that you asked the audience. So she says, thank you for this presentation. I love the history part. And in response to your question, as faculty members in English universities in Quebec, we are often the spokespeople for bilingualism. French as a second language across Canada and English as a second language in Quebec, with our colleagues who are not necessarily involved with language education.
Thank you. I appreciate that comment. You know, like I said before, the existence of French immersion and other French second language education programs in Quebec, but across Canada, it exists in large part thanks to the English-speaking community of Quebec. When you just look at the history, the origins of the program, with mothers and parents in and around Montreal advocating, saying, hey, I want my kid to be bilingual. And then other parts of the country picking up on that. Then also just teachers. I did French immersion in Regina and Saskatchewan, and I had Quebecers, both Francophones and Anglophones, as teachers. Actually, one of my favorite teachers was Mr. Coleman in grade 4. He was an Anglo-Montrealer. And I thought he was just the coolest guy, and he spoke impeccable French and English, obviously, and had regaled us with all sorts of great stories. But for me, that was a really valuable education to acquaint myself with the English-speaking community of Quebec. That, oh, okay, there's this, you know, because outside of Quebec, we often hear Quebec equals French, but it's obviously more complex than that. And so having a teacher who was an Anglophone from Montreal, but who could speak French, was a real education for me, just to inform me about the reality of his community. I remember him talking about his mother too, who could only speak English and getting around the city and stuff, but that he had learned French. And his father was captured at Hong Kong in the Battle of Hong Kong. Anyway, he had Mr. Coleman, a great Anglo-Montrealer who had great stories for us, helped to educate me about that reality. And again, thanks to you guys, kids like me and the rest of Canada have some opportunity to learn French.
We have a raised hand from Lorraine, and then a question from Meredith. Lorraine, I would invite you to ask your question, please.
Just a comment, Robert, excuse me, about the place of people who are kind of in the middle or moderate voice. I agree with you that that's important. And I would add that events, obviously, I work at QUESCREN, obviously events like this and research events are good venues. I've had occasion recently to be interviewed for a number of media outlets, and it's very striking that journalists doing their job obviously want to get the story, the drama, the conflict, and saying, well, there are two sides to the story. There's both good and bad in Bill 101. We have to recognize what it accomplished as well as some of its shortcomings. That kind of thing is boring. You know, that's not what journalists want. So there seems to be an inherent quality of media and probably social media to dramatize and take away some of that moderation that I think we need.
Thank you, Lorraine.
Definitely sympathize with that viewpoint.
Looking at the chat, Robert, Meredith McKean is asking, what is the legal superiority of the Official Language Act versus Bill 101? Where does human rights come into decisions deciding the legality of these acts?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I'm not very well equipped to answer that one, not being not having a legal background. But it's, I guess, a fundamental constitutional question. In principle, Bill 101 relates to provincial areas of jurisdiction, and the Official Languages Act relates to federal areas of jurisdiction, and then how those two, but of course, all legislation, whether provincial or federal, is subject to the Constitution of Canada, which includes the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So I think that's the best I can do. That's a fundamental question, but unfortunately, I don't have the appropriate legal background to really answer that in a more meaningful way. But thanks for the question.
Thank you. I see that Matthew Hodge has his hand up, but we had a question that came in before. So I'll first go to that question by Gail West, who writes, in the building and maintaining of language laws in Canada, I think there is a lack of input from university researchers studying languages spoken in Canada. The entire reasons for modifying language laws don't seem to be based on the reality of increases or decreases in the use of English or French or the growth of bilingual communities in Canada. I don't know, Robert, if you would like to add observations about this comment.
Yeah, I don't know that I can speak to that, the second part of that observation, but I would definitely agree that sound laws and sound policy originate from sound research. We need to know what we're talking about. We need to, you know, how do we know what do we know, and how do we know what we think we know? You know, these are fundamental questions that we should always be asking ourselves, and why research is so important for good policy and good legislation. Thanks.
Thank you. Matthew Hodge, you have your hand raised. I wonder if it's in response to Robert's question, or you would like to ask a question?
A little bit of both. So as a Westerner from Alberta, from a small town, I found there's not enough French immersion. Like, I did not have the choice to actually go to a French immersion school, as well. Also, my dad is from Lennoxville or Sherbrooke. So I do know a lot about Quebec just from being able to travel here as a young person. Now, I feel like there's a lack of, I guess, culture that has been brought out to the West. I feel like it's not readily available, only in the big city centers like Calgary, Edmonton, or even Peace River is it's a very Francophone community up there where you can actually have access to it. But that's the thing, is I feel like it's not very well accessible for people in the rural centers, especially. And I feel like for me, who really wanted to be here, I'm now establishing in Quebec. I moved here for university and other reasons too. But for me, I'm going out of my way to become bilingual. It's been very difficult with me, especially being around, not even being able to be learning very much, only in universities. So I feel like the education is there, but it's just not well presented. And I feel like if they bridge the gap between Western Canada and Quebec by being a better, I guess, ambassador for the French language to become more bilingual, I feel like the Westerners would now be able to see a little bit on both sides. Now being involved with it, or in the middle of everything here, being immersed in it, it's now I see both sides. So for me, it makes sense. But anyway, my question is how do we bridge that gap of bringing it to the West so that they're not scared that their language is getting threatened just like everybody else?
Thank you, Matthew. That's a great question, and I sympathize with it. You know, I felt lucky. I grew up in Regina, so we had access to French immersion there, but you're right. Most kids, most Anglophone kids outside Quebec do not have access to French immersion. There is core French and other much more limited French second language education provided. But I think the latest stats that I've seen, around 11 or 12% of kids, English-speaking kids outside Quebec, are in French immersion programs, which is more than it's ever been. So it's not for a lack of demand. Parents outside of Quebec and inside Quebec, of course, they want their kids to learn both languages. They want their kids to have opportunity, have access to this opportunity. So it's not for lack of demand. I think a big challenge is political will, and resources, and then also personnel. We did a study, it was published in 2019, on the lack of French second language education teachers. So we need more teachers. and then those teachers need to be better supported. And that's something that came out of our study. But I have a lot of sympathy for Anglophones in other parts of the country who never had an opportunity even to learn another language, specifically French. So it's not easy. Sometimes we speak derisively of the lower levels of bilingualism among Anglophones outside Quebec, but we need to remember that not everyone has had a meaningful access to the opportunity to learn. But we put out a study on that, and we're glad to see that it appears to be a priority of the government to work with the provinces to increase that opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. We have time for one last question. Marian Sandylines has her hand raised up. Marian, please go ahead.
Hi, Robert, I really enjoyed your presentation. I love the way your face lights up when you talk about English-speaking Quebecers. It's quite refreshing given the year that English-speaking Quebecers have been having. I was actually quite struck in your presentation by the continuity that you drew between the kind of debates that are being had in 2019 versus 1929. I never thought about it that way, and it was very, very interesting. I'm going to ask you the crystal ball question. You talked about, the continuity, but also there have been changes in Canadian society in the last 90 years, obviously. Some of the same arguments coming up. What do you foresee? And you talked about the risk of losing the moderate voices in the cacophony. What do you see for the next, I guess it's going to be a big year in official languages this year. So this year, but also maybe, 10, 20 years in the future. What do you expect will happen with the conversation?
Oof. Let me consult the ether.
I get the crystal ball question all the time, so I'm going to you now.
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, well, I'll give you my pessimistic outlook first, and then my optimistic outlook after that. The big part of me, and I spoke to a little bit, I am really worried about the big change. So, like you say, a lot of the arguments have remained the same, difference of emphasis and degree, blah blah blah, but the big change and what's different today than in the past is now anybody can say anything, and what gets the most attention is the most sensationalized, the most offensive, the least nuanced statements. And so, throwing shade can get you a lot of likes on on Twitter. You see your notifications go up, you get a little endorphin hit. You feel good about yourself. And so I'm really afraid of what that has done and could do to the discourse, making our discourse more limited, more mean-spirited, less nuanced. And that's why it's so important that moderate civil society, members of civil society engage in that discourse, so that we don't leave the mic just to the most extreme and angriest, loudest voices. What makes me hopeful, I think, is that if we can continue to show how language rights accommodation is important to making Canada possible, which I do think most people still appreciate. And the interest as Canada becomes more and more diverse, the demonstrative interest of diverse groups in learning both official languages, I think gives me hope for the future. Immigrant parents, they want their kids to learn both official languages too. And some of the stats suggest that kids who have another mother tongue are just as likely or even more likely to also be English, French bilingual. So these things can be complementary. If we can continue to show that, then I think there can be continued support for official languages in Canada. So, and I think too, what also makes me optimistic is, we see stuff, we see a lot of angry stuff in messages and social media, but I like to have to believe most people are decent and open to difference and interested in the other in Canada. And I think public opinion surveys bear that out. Sometimes, our survey in 2016, the results, the support for official languages out west was a lot higher than people thought. And a lot of people were surprised by that. But myself, being from Western Canada, I was like, hey, we're not all so bad. That people, most people, I think, are decent and are open to difference. And so that's what makes me, that the angry voices don't speak for everyone. In fact, they don't speak for most people. And so that's what makes me optimistic. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Robert. These are great words to end our discussion on. And I would like to thank all of our participants for their comments, for their questions. Thank you also, Robert, for a very, very interesting and engaging presentation and discussion. So thank you all again for being here today. We wish you a great day and see you next time. Bye.